recently got this book of classic ghost stories. A spine-tingling introduction to Gothic literature. I know it's a little bit early for spooky season, but for me it's always going to be Halloween, no matter the season. I love Halloween. I love Gothic stuff. I love horror. So I thought it would be fun to read out one of these stories to you. I love the cover. You have 3 little bats. And the house is a bit 3D. You have 3 spooky eyes. Here's the contents. Narrative of the Ghost of a Hand by J. Sheridan Lee Fanu. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This one I might pronounce pretty badly, but I'll try. You could go ahead and correct me in the comments if I get it wrong. But the legend of Don Monio Sancho de Hinojosa. I'm pretty sure that's how it's pronounced, but I could be very wrong. By Washington Irving. The Phantom Coach by Amelia B. Edwards. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. The Bottomless Grave by Ambrose Bierce. The Signal Man by Charles Dickens. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. The Haunted Doll's House by M.R. James. The Adventure of the German Student, another Washington Irving story. There was a man dwelt by a churchyard, another M.R. James story. Man Size in Marble, E. Nesbit. And finally, The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. I love these little vine details. We're gonna start off with the very first story. And if you enjoy, then maybe I'll read the others. ghost of a hand. J. Sheridan Lee Fanning. Has these beautiful fine details all over the page. I'm pretty sure she believed every word she related, for old Sally was voracious. But all this was worth just so much as such talk commonly is. Marvels, fabulae, what our ancestors called winter's tales, which gathered details from every narrator and elated in the act of narration. Still, it was not quite for nothing that the house was held to be haunted. Under all this smoke, there smoldered just a little spark of truth, an authenticated mystery, for the solution of which some of my readers may possibly suggest a theory, though I confess I can't. Miss Rebecca Shadisworth, in a letter dated late in the autumn of 1753, gives a minute and curious relation of occurrences in the tiled house, which, it is plain, although at starting she protests against all such fooleries, she has heard with a peculiar sort of interest, and relates it certainly with an awful sort of particularity. I was for printing the entire letter, which is really very singular as well as characteristic, but my publisher meets me with his veto, and I believe he is right. The worthy old lady's letter is perhaps too long. I must rest content with a few hungry notes of its tenor. That year, and somewhere about the 24th October, there broke out a strange dispute between Mr. Alderman Harper of High Street, Dublin, and my Lord Castle Mallard, who, in virtue of his cousinship to the young heir's mother, had undertaken for him the management of the tiny estate on which the tiled house, for I find it spelt both ways, stood. This Alderman Harper had agreed for a lease of the house for his daughter, who was married to a gentleman named Prosser. He furnished it and put up hangings, and otherwise went to considerable expense. Mr. and Mrs. Prosser came there sometime in June, and after having parted with a good many servants and interval, she made up her mind that she would not live in the house, and her father waited on Lord Castlemartyr, and told him plainly that he would not take out such a lease, that he would not take out the lease because the house was subjected to annoyances which he could not explain. In plain terms, he said it was haunted, and that no servants would live there more than a few weeks, and that after what his son-in-law's family had suffered there, not only should he be excused from taking the lease of it, but that the house itself ought to be pulled down as a nuisance, and the habitual haunt of something worse than human malefactors. Lord Castlemartyr filed a bill in the equity side of the exchequer. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. To compel Mr. Alderman Harper to perform his contract by taking out the lease. But the alderman drew an answer, supported by no less than 7 long affidavits. That's a bit of a struggle for me to say. Copies of all which were furnished to his lordship, and with the desired effect, for rather than compel him to place them upon, release him. For rather than compel him to place them upon the file of the court, his lordship struck and consented to release him. I am sorry the cause did not proceed at least far enough to place upon the files of the court a very authentic and accountable story which Miss Rebecca retails. The annoyances described did not begin until the end of August. One evening, Mrs. Prosser, quite alone, was sitting in the twilight at the back parlor window. It was open, and looking out into the orchard, she plainly saw a hand stealthily placed upon the stone window sill outside, as if by someone beneath the window at her right side, intending to climb up. There was nothing but the hand, which was rather short but handsomely formed, and white and plump, laid on the edge of the window-sill. And it was not a very young hand, but one aged somewhere about 40, as she conjectured. It was only a few weeks before that the horrible robbery at Clondalkin had taken place, and the lady fancied that the hand was that of one of the miscreants who was now about to scale the windows of the tiled house. She uttered a loud scream and an exclamation of terror, and at the same moment the hand was quietly withdrawn. Search was made in the orchard, but no indications of any persons having been under the window, beneath which, ranged along the wall, stood a great column of flower pots, which it seemed must have prevented anyone's coming within reach of it. The same night there came a hasty tapping every now and then at the window of the kitchen. The women grew frightened, and the servant man, taking firearms with him, opened the back door, but discovered nothing. As he shut it, however, he said, a thump came on it, and a pressure as of somebody striving to force his way in, which frightened him. And though the tapping went on upon the kitchen window panes, he made no further explorations. About 6 o'clock on the Saturday evening following, the cook, an honest, sober woman, now aged nigh 60 years, being alone in the kitchen, saw on looking up, it is supposed, the same fat but aristocratic-looking hand, laid with its palm against the glass, near the side of the window, and this time moving slowly up and down, pressed all the while against the glass, as if feeling carefully for some inequality in the surface. She cried out and said something like a prayer on seeing it, but it was not withdrawn for several seconds after. After this, for a great many nights, there came at first a low and afterwards an angry rapping, as it seemed with a set of clenched knuckles, at the back door, and the servant man would not open it, but called out to know who was there, and there came no answer, only the sound as if the palm of the hand was placed against it, and drawn slowly from side to side with a sort of groping motion. All this time, sitting in the back parlor, which for the time they used as a drawing room, Mr. and Mrs. Prosser were disturbed by rappings at the window, sometimes very low and furtive, like a clandestine signal, and at others sudden and so loud as to threaten the breaking of the pane. This was all at the back of the house, which looked upon the orchard, as you know. But on the Tuesday night, at about 9:30, there came precisely the same rapping at the hall door, and it went on, to the great annoyance of the master and terror of his wife, at intervals for nearly 2 hours. After this, for several days and nights, they had no annoyance whatsoever, and began to think that the nuisance had expended itself. But on the night of the 13th September, Jane Easterbrook, an English maid, having gone to the pantry for a small silver bowl in which her mistress' bedtime drink was served, happening to look up at the little window of only 4 panes, observed through the auger hole, which was drilled through the window frame for the admission of a bolt to secure the shutter. A white pudgy finger. First the tip, and then the two first joints introduced, and turned about thus away, and that, crooked against the inside, as if in search of a fastening, which its owner disdained to push aside. When the maid got back into the kitchen, we are told she fell into a swoon and was all the next day very weak. Mr. Prosser, being, I've heard, a hard-headed and conceited sort of fellow, shouted the ghost, and sneered at the fears of his family. He was privately of the opinion that the whole affair was a practical joke or a fraud, and waited for an opportunity to catch the rogue in flagrant delicto. He did not long to keep this theory to himself, but let it out by degrees with no stint of oaths and threats, believing that some domestic traitor held the thread of the conspiracy. Indeed, it was time something were done, for not only his servants, but good Mrs. Prosser herself, had grown to look unhappy and anxious. They kept at home from the hour of sunset, and would not venture about the house after nightfall, except in couples. The knocking had ceased for about a week, when one night, Mrs. Prosser being in the nursery, her husband, who was in the parlour, heard it begin very softly at the hall door. The air was quite still, which favoured his hearing distinctly. This was the first time there had been any disturbance at the side of the house, and the character of the summons was changed. Mr. Prosser, leaving the parlour door open, it seems, went quietly into the hall. The sound was that of beating on the outside of the stout door, softly and regularly. With that fat of the hand, he was going to open it. Suddenly but changed his mind, and went back very quietly and on to the head of the kitchen stair, where was a strong closet over the pantry, in which he kept his firearms, swords, and canes. Where he called his manservant, whom he believed to be honest, and with a pair of loaded pistols in his own coat pocket, and given another pair to him, he went as lightly as he could, followed by the man, and with a stout walking cane in his hand, forward to the door. Everything went as Mr. Prosser wished. The besaker of his house, so far from taking fright at their approach, grew more impatient, and the sort of patting which had aroused his attention at first assumed the rhythm and emphasis of a series of double knocks. Mr. Prosser, angry, opened the door with his right arm across, cane in hand, looking. He saw nothing, but his arm was jerked up oddly, as it might be with the hollow of a hand, and something passed under it, with a kind of gentle squeeze. The servant near saw nor felt anything, and did not know why his master looked back so hastily, cutting with his cane and shutting the door with so sudden a slam. From that time, Mr. Prosser discontinued his angry talk and swearing about it, and seemed nearly as averse from the subject as the rest of his family. He grew, in fact, very uncomfortable, feeling an inward persuasion that when, in answer to the summons, he had opened the hall door, he had actually given admission to the Besager. I'm not familiar with that word, so I don't know how to pronounce it. He said nothing to Mrs. Prosser, but went up earlier to his bedroom, where he read a while in his Bible, and said his prayers. I hope the particular relation of this circumstance does not indicate its singularity. He lay awake a good while, it appears, and, as he supposed, about the 12:15, he heard the soft palm of a hand patting on the outside of the bedroom door, then brushed slowly along it. Up bounced Mr. Prosser, very much frightened, and locked the door, crying, "Who's there?" but receiving no answer, but the same brushing sound of a soft hand drawn over the panels, which he knew only too well. In the morning, the housemaid was terrified by the impression of a hand in the dust of the little parlor table, where they had been unpacking Delft and other things the day before. The print of the naked foot in the sea sand did not frighten Robinson Crusoe half so much. They were by this time all nervous, and some of them half crazed, about the hand. Mr. Prosser went to examine the mark, and made light of it, but, as he swore afterwards, rather to quiet his servants than from any comfortable feelings about it in his own mind. However, he had them all one by one in the room, and made each place his and her hand palm downward on the same table, thus taking the similar impression from every person in the house, including himself and his wife, and his affidavit disposed that the formation of the hand so impressed differed altogether from those of the living inhabitants of the house, and corresponded with that of the hand seen by Mrs. Prosser and by the cook. Whoever or whatever the owner of that hand might be, they all felt his subtle demonstration to mean that it was declared he was no longer out of doors, but had established himself in the house. Now Mrs. Prosser began to be troubled with strange and horrible dreams, some of which, as set out in detail in Aunt Rebecca's letter, long letter, are really very appalling nightmares. But one night, as Mr. Prosser closed his bedchamber door, he was struck somewhat by the utter silence of the room, there being no sound of breathing, which seemed strange to him, as he knew his wife was in the bed and his ears were particularly sharp. There was a candle burning on a small table at the foot of the bed. Besides the one he held in his hand, a heavy ledger connected with his father-in-law's business being under his arm. He drew the curtain at one side of the bed and saw Mrs. Prosser lying. As for a few seconds, he mortally feared. Dead, her face being motionless, white, uncovered, with a cold dew. And on the pillow, close beside her head, and just within the curtains, was, as he first thought, a toad, but really the same fattish hand, the wrist resting on the pillow, and the fingers extended towards her temple. Mr. Prosser, with a horrified jerk, pitched the ledger directly at the curtains, behind which the owner of the hand might be supposed to stand. The hand was instantaneously and smoothly snatched away. The curtains made a great wave, and Mr. Prosser got round the bed in time to see the closet door, which was at the other side, pulled to by the same white, puffy hand as he believed. He drew the door open with a fling and stared in, but the closet was empty, except for the clothes hanging from the pegs on the wall, and the dressing table and the looking-glass facing the window. He shut it sharply and locked it, and felt for a minute, he says, as if he were like to lose his wits. Then, ringing at the bell, he brought the servants, and with much ado they recovered Mrs. Prosser from a sort of trance, in which, he says, from her looks she seemed to have suffered the pains of death. And Aunt Rebecca adds, from what she told me of her visions, with her own lips, you might have added, and of hell also. The occurrence which seems to have determined the crisis was the strange sickness of their eldest child, a little boy aged between 2 and 3 years. He lay awake, seemingly in paroxysms of terror, and the doctors who were called and set down the symptoms to incipient water on the brain. Mrs. Prosser used to sit up with the nurse by the nursery fire, which, troubled in mind about the condition of her child, his bed was placed sideways along the wall, with its head against the door of the press or cupboard, which, however, did not shut quite close. There was a little valance about a foot deep round the top of the child's bed, and this descended within some 10 or 12 inches of the pillow on which it lay. They observed that the little creature was quieter whenever they took it up and held it on their laps. They had just replaced him, as he seemed to have grown quite sleepy and tranquil, but he was not 5 minutes in his bed when he began to scream in one of his frenzies of terror. At the same moment, the nurse, for the first time, detected, and Mrs. Prosser equally plainly saw, following the direction of her eyes, the real cause of the child's suffering, protruding through the aperture of the press and shrouded in the shade of the valance. They plainly saw the white, fat hand, palm downwards, presented towards the head of the child. The mother uttered a scream and snatched the child from its little bed, and she and the nurse ran down to the ladies' sleeping room, where Mr. Prosser was in bed, shutting the door as they entered. They had hardly done so when a gentle tap came to it from the outside. There is a great deal more, but this will suffice. The singularity of the narrative seems to me to be this, that it describes the ghost of a hand and no more. The person to whom the hand belonged never once appeared, nor was it a hand separated from a body, but only a hand so manifested and introduced that its owner was always, by some crafty accident, hidden from view. In the year 1819, at a college breakfast, I met Mr. Prosser, a thin, grave, but rather chatty old gentleman, with very white hair drawn back into a pigtail. He told us all, with a concise particularity, a story of his cousin James Prosser, who, when an infant, had slept for some time in what his mother said was a haunted nursery in an old house near Chapelizod, and who, whenever he was ill or over-fatigued or in any wise feverish, suffered all through his life as he had done from a time he could scarce remember, from a vision of a certain gentleman, fat and pale, every curl of whose wig, every button and fold of whose laced clothes, and every feature and line of whose sensual benignant and unwholesome face was as minutely engraven upon his memory as the dress and lineaments of his own grandfather's portrait, which hung before him every day at breakfast, dinner, and supper. Mr. Prosser mentioned this as an instance of a curiously monotonous individualized and persistent nightmare, and hinted the extreme horror and anxiety with which his cousin, of whom he spoke in the past tense as poor Jemmy, was at any time induced to mention it. I hope the reader will pardon me for loitering so long in the tiled house, but this sort of lore has always had a charm for me, and people, especially old people, will talk of what most interests themselves, too often forgetting what others may have had more than enough of it. That is the end of the story. It was a bit fascinating, although some of the words were a little difficult to read, but it is an old story, so. I hope you enjoyed that spooky tale of a ghost hand. And I apologize for any stutterings or not knowing how to pronounce certain words. But I hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you want to hear any more spooky stories.